Paul is for you. Okay, good.
Yes. So I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Aydogan Ozcan, who's been at UCLA since 2007. He rocketed up the promotion ladder from assistant professor all the way now to being a chancellor's professor at UCLA. He's remarkably creative and innovative. And as you heard a little bit in that discussion, he really looks to get his work out in the world. He's recently elected a member of the National Academy of Inventors, and he's a fellow of many engineering and science societies and the Guggenheim Foundation. I want to leave him plenty of time to talk so you get to see all that he's done. He has a very, very long list of awards, and I treasure every interaction with him. I'm always looking for him, whether it's at our faculty club or his favorite cafe, which I'll go out of my way to walk by to see if I might grab a few minutes with him. And so it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Aydogan Ozcan.
Thank you, Paul. You're very kind and very generous with your introduction. So on a personal note, of course, I mean, I've learned so much from Paul. He's always a source of wisdom for us. And over the years, I think I owe, of course, a big chunk of our success to colleagues, great colleagues, mentors like Paul. He's very generous with his time and with sharing his wisdom. So thank you again for all your friendship and beautiful, for being who you are at UCLA and for many of us in the field. So from a Los Angeles morning, a beautiful day here. Hello, everyone. Let me full screen my slides. So today, in this presentation, I'll talk to you about our work on computational imaging and sensing, and how we create mobile measurement devices that have implications for biomedical applications, point of care medicine, mobile health, and others. Toward the second half of my talk, I'll also specifically dive into deep learning and tell you more about how it has been helping us to improve some of these instrumentation to get better in what they do. So in a nutshell, our lab is focused on creating mobile instrumentation, mobile measurement tools. We aim to democratize advanced measurement techniques by making them cost-effective, compact, field portable, and perform the same kind of measurements with the same resolution, sensitivity, specificity that you would expect from their lab-grade counterparts. This way you can actually perform various different measurements that would normally require, for example, the patient to go to a central lab hospital, leave the specimen for analysis, and then go back to their home, and then with all the delays of the sample processing and reporting. All of that could be actually performed even in resource poor settings if you had advanced measurement tools simplified and made field portable. So along this quest, mobile phones, smartphones, and their components have been helping us to create miniaturized instrumentation. What I share with you here on this slide are some of those examples that utilize the smartphone as a platform for measurements. It's now routine for us to conduct microscopic investigation of specimen, whether it's bright field microscopy, fluorescence microscopy. You can actually utilize the smartphone as the basis of these measurements. Sometimes we also create standalone devices as shown here, which utilize CMOS imagers of smartphones to create these handheld microscopy systems. For example, I'll spend quite a bit of my time here on this device, which is a lens-free on-chip holographic microscope, which can achieve about 1 billion useful pixels to create a diffraction limited microscopic image of a sample with a very large field of view and a distant resolution at the same time, especially important for telepathology applications looking into, for example, blood smears and pap smears, tissue samples, many different examples I'll share with you today. So as I mentioned, mobile microscopy tools are now possible to be miniaturized into a handheld system as shown here. This is a dark field and fluorescence microscope, a very inexpensive, cost-effective embodiment that utilizes 3D printers and inexpensive optics to convert a smartphone into a fluorescence microscope. Over a very large field of view with simple silane chemistry, you can actually stretch DNA molecules and see even individual double-stranded DNA molecules that are fluorescently tagged. This work was published in one of my favorite journals, ACS Nano, which I also review a lot of articles every month or every other month. In fact, I currently have an assignment and hope to get back to Paul in the next few days without being delayed, of course. So this is actually a very interesting tool in the sense that over the last 10 years, I've seen personally how it advances, a mobile microscope, mobile phone-based microscope. When we first started this line of research, believe it or not, phones were not smart. They were quite primitive compared to what we have today, and we could barely see a red blood cell. Diameter of a red blood cell is about 7 microns. Now you can see individual viruses, bacteria, even a single DNA molecule, and size it with about 1 kilobase pair sizing accuracy. So it's sufficient enough to do certain genetic tests. Looking at copy number variations would be possible with these kinds of devices. In a recent work in collaboration with Stockholm University, we created a multimodal microscopy tool that images the specimen in bright field microscopy as well as in 2 different channels of fluorescence. So this is dual color fluorescence microscopy. And we have utilized it for targeted DNA sequencing, tested for detection of colon cancer mutation analysis, basically, using rolling circle amplification. It's a process that creates clusters of DNA based on a point mutation. We can actually have mutant fluoresce at a certain color and wild type fluoresce at a different color. With this kind of a device, we did basically targeted DNA sequencing at the tissue level and showed the value of this kind of a mobile readout instrumentation in looking into patient specimen colon cancer patients in this case, to show you how some of these instrumentation can really simplify and replace rather expensive instrumentation, microscopy instrumentation that are being used in laboratory settings. So as I mentioned, in addition to fluorescence microscopy, in addition to installing instrumentation at the back of a smartphone, sometimes we like to work with the CMOS imagers that are embedded in our mobile instrumentation. So in this line of work, we basically strip off almost all the components that you have in a microscopy tool and create lensless, lens-free microscopy solutions to provide extreme space bandwidth product in a very inexpensive computational system. So if you look at, for example, one of these devices, which is a lensless microscope, at the heart, you have the CMOS imager. Basically, one of the most important elements of a lensless microscope is the CMOS imager or the CCD that is at the heart of this holographic microscope. The sample, which is a transmissive sample, goes through this opening here, which sits on top of the image sensor, typically sub-millimeter gap between the sample and the sensor. The rest is actually fairly simple. This prototype, believe it or not, was put together by one of our undergraduate students. So it's fairly inexpensive and simple to put together. And what you have in here is an illumination module composed of a number of LEDs and a simple microcontroller, the main function of which is to turn on and off these LEDs one by one, which helps us to take one of those pixels and virtually divide it into smaller pixels. For example, you might have here 1 to 2 micron pixel size. In this on-chip imaging geometry, that would be limiting your resolution. Through these LEDs and turning them on and off, we virtually shift the holograms to create super resolution. So you can take a 10 megapixel imager and convert it to 1,000 megapixels to sample the diffracted field here on the CMOS imager, which is the basis of essentially these holographic microscopes and which utilize holographic reconstruction procedures. So the heart of these types of microscopes is actually shadow imaging. Through those CMOS images, we are imaging the holographic shadows of the specimen. If you place, for example, a tissue sample, this is a thin tissue section, a few microns thick histopathologist slide. And if you look at that kind of a tissue section with our microscope, what you see here is a speckle pattern. These are inline holograms of the specimen. They do not mean anything to your bare eye because we're not trained to look at these types of images. Only after holographic reconstruction, only after phase retrieval, we can actually invert these and go back to the sample plane to reveal the subcellular features that make up this tissue section. So from these holographic patterns, we reconstruct using phase retrieval algorithms the complex information of the tissue samples. These are nuclear features of the tissue sample. In this case, it's a cancer tissue. So obviously there are numerous advantages of this type of scheme. It's field portable, significantly more cost effective compared to standard microscopy tools, and it has a larger throughput. It can enable actually various interesting new science to be performed with lensless microscopy tools as opposed to lens-based bulky instrumentation. This is one of our earlier prototypes that in fact utilize something like 5 megapixel imager. None of our mobile phones would have this kind of a CMOS imager nowadays, but this is what we had several years ago. And what you're seeing here is an image of malaria-infected red blood cells. If you take a traditional a microscope and inspect, for example, a thin blood smear, a monolayer of cells, you would see that some of the red blood cells look beautifully healthy, but some of them have these pinkish features. That's a parasite invading the red blood cell, and soon it's going to explode it. The same fields of view are shown here in the phase channel after the reconstruction with this kind of a microscope. You can clearly see the signature of the parasites in the phase channel, beautifully shown here, representing actually the invasion of the red blood cell with these parasites. One of the major advantages, in addition to being compact and cost-effective, being field portable, is that we can look at a very large field of view and look for example, these are some white blood cells, mostly red blood cells, and some of them are infected. If you zoom into these types of images, you can see the infected cells. Microscopy today is still the gold standard, one of the gold standard methods to diagnose malaria. And at the same time, to understand the efficacy of the treatment, you need to look at the parasite count, peristemia. And that's why seeing these parasites within the red blood cells is still considered a very important milestone in diagnosing and treating malaria-positive patients. This is another slide showing it for histopathology slide imaging. This is a thin tissue section, a few microns thick, exactly as it is used in histopathology. And it highlights also the field of view advantage here. For example, a typical 40x objective lens would be looking at a field of view like this. The lensless microscopy has unit magnification because it's on a chip. The sample sits on a chip. As a result, you can have the entire active area of the CMOS imager as your field of view. You're looking at something like 30 millimeter square field of view here. What would happen with a traditional lens-based microscope is you would be scanning the sample and you would be taking hundreds of images with this 4DX to cover this entire field of view. If you look at the raw images, they're holographic. Only after you reconstruct, you can see these beautiful features as shown here. And these are comparisons coming from its standard lab-grade benchtop microscopy tools, giving you beautiful contrast and resolution as expected. We can also bring color to lens-free holographic microscopy. This is a coherent or partially coherent imaging modality. And like any other holographic system, it works with single frequency illumination. But you can utilize Bayer filters, red, green, and blue filters as part of our CMOS imagers, and create some unique inverse imaging problem with a single snapshot illumination at 3 different wavelengths. You can actually create holograms at 3 different bands and reconstruct them to create colorful reconstructions of the tissue sample. This is a lung sample, pneumonia patient, and it's H&E stained. Field of view advantage is shown here. This is the reconstruction result. If you zoom in to different parts of this image, we can see clearly enlarged fields of view showing digitally features, finer features. You can continue zooming in, as I show here, and you can zoom in to continue seeing finer and finer features. So here I'll show you another zoomed in region of interest from the same specimen to reveal some finer features that you can reconstruct with these microscopy tools, approaching easily about 1 billion useful pixels across a field of view of something like 20-30 millimeters squared, depending on the CMOS imager that you utilize. So far, I've been talking about lensless microscopy solutions that utilized CMOS imagers. The scale bar of most of these images was about 1 millimeter. And these were literally smartphone CMOS imagers manufactured mostly by Sony. But you don't have to restrict yourself to just CMOS technology. You can also utilize charge-coupled devices, as I show here. This is a fairly old CCD, originally manufactured by Kodak, no longer in business. This highlights some unique opportunities. Depending on the resolution and field of view combination that you need, you can actually utilize different image sensors. If you're really hungry for field of view, with a CCD, you can actually look at several centimeter square field of view. In this case, the scale bar is 1 centimeter, and across this about 18 centimeters square. With a modest resolution, about 2 microns, you can reveal finer features of specimen. For example, these are sperm samples that are reconstructed from their holograms across this large field of view. Especially useful for needle in a haystack type of problems. This also highlights a very interesting feature of lensless microscopy. That is, resolution is not directly tied to the sample volume or the sample field of view that you have. For example, today, let's say I have a 10 megapixel imager of one kind. Next year, if I have a 40 megapixel imager of the same pixel architecture, I'll basically keep my resolution the same, but improve my field of view and sample volume at least by 4-fold. And if you have a smaller pixel size and a larger number of pixels, you can improve both field of view and resolution also at the same time. These are very interesting aspects of on-chip microscopy in terms of its utilization of the space bandwidth product dictated by mostly the CMOS or CCD image sensor, signal-to-noise ratio, and your reconstruction engine. So lensless microscopy is also great for moving specimen. So far, I've been focusing on static samples, like tissue samples, smears, blood smears, and other kinds of samples that were static, and after you image them, they would be stored or tossed away. But lensless microscopy is also quite exciting and powerful to look at locomotion patterns in 3 dimensions. Here, for example, I'm sharing with you our results on looking at sperm locomotion in 3D. Not just a few sperms, but thousands of sperms placed on a chip where we would like to track their locomotion with submicron 3D localization accuracy across a very large volume. Roughly speaking, approaching 10 microliters of sample volume, close to 3 orders of magnitude larger than the volume that a lens-based microscope can look. We were aiming to image the 3D patterns of these sperms. Every one of those colorful patterns here is, roughly speaking, 11-second locomotion in 3D of one of the sperms that we imaged and reconstructed. For this, we utilize the same idea of placing the specimen on top of a CMOS imager. And this time, we're using 2 different colors of LEDs at 2 different angles to be able to reveal the 3D patterns of the sperm head in a dynamic fashion, let's say at a frame rate of 100 frames per second. You may be wondering, well, probably we're using here a color CMOS imager to make use of color in this case. In reality, actually, this was a monochrome sensor. It's color blind. The reason that we were using these 2 angles at 2 different colors of illumination was simply to be able to differentiate from a single hologram acquisition different perspectives created by the red vertical and the blue oblique illumination. By digitally tuning the reconstruction wavelength from red to blue, we could see these volume at the oblique perspective, and by digitally tuning the wavelength to 600 nanometers for, let's say, red, we were able to see vertical projection. This is how we can triangulate and pinpoint to the center of mass of the sperm head with a submicron localization accuracy without sacrificing field of view, without sacrificing volume, and without sacrificing frame rate. So for example, this one is a human sperm that we reconstructed. It's 1 second of its locomotion. It performs something like 10 rotations per second with a beautiful diameter of 2 to 3 micron. This is the diameter that the sperm helical pattern is happening. This happens 4 to 5% of time in vitro. It's a very rare type of locomotion, and we, through our throughput, because of the large volume that we can image, we were able to see these types of patterns in freely moving sperm samples. This one is another example. Again, color represents time. It's roughly 1 second of the locomotion. It's also a helical pattern, but slightly irregular. This is a hyperactivated sperm. This is a hyperactivated sperm that is even more rare. This happens less than 1% of the time. It's the precision of our instrumentation and the throughput that enabled us to see these kinds of rare and precise locomotion patterns in freely moving sperm. Obviously, if you were to try to see the same kinds of patterns with a traditional lens-based microscope, because the motion is happening mostly in axial directions, you'd be missing them. So they would be out of focus. But the holography has a large depth of field through computation, and that's essentially how we can observe some of these difficult to see patterns. And the throughput is second to none in the sense that you can look at thousands of these trajectories all in parallel. So we have looked into many different sperm samples from different species. These are some human samples. There are roughly speaking, 24,000 dots in here, corresponding to 24,000 individual measurements. We've quantified various different features of their locomotion, their linearity, beating frequency, curvilinear velocity, etc. And out of these motile sperms that we've investigated, interestingly, about 1,000 of them were helical, conducting these beautiful helical patterns. And out of those 1,000 helical patterns, 90% of them were right-handed. Only about 10% of these were having a left-handed helical pattern. So this is one of those very interesting and confusing observations, because this percentage split, 90% and 10%, is exactly the same split that we have with respect to right-handed and left-handed people in the world. Of course, there's literally no real correlation that we can think of between these two different concepts, but it's one of those coincidences that is kind of joking at you. So, but it's the precision and throughput, 96 out of 24,000 is what it takes to capture these statistics. Since then, we've been playing with this platform with various different types of sperm. What you're looking at here is horse sperm conducting a helical ribbon. So it's a zigzag pattern. In this case, the sperm is conducting a sinusoidal pattern, but the plane is twisting like a ribbon, like a beautiful ribbon as shown here with time. So color again represents time. So this is a beautiful mathematical function that you can program, but the sperm in this case is preferring to conduct this kind of a chiral ribbon. We do not know under what conditions sperms prefer these types of locomotion, but these are the patterns that were happening in vitro at least for literally centuries, but it takes a computational microscope and its degrees of freedom to reveal some of these beautiful patterns that I show here in the form of this chiral ribbon. It's about 4.5 seconds of the locomotion of this sperm. This one is another one. It's a twisted ribbon. Basically, this is a minimal surface. Mathematically, this is called helicoid. It exhibits zero net curvature. And the sperm in this case is conducting this helicoid pattern, which is again a beautiful mathematical construct. And under certain conditions, sperms prefer to have this mode of locomotion. And this one is a higher frame rate lens-free reconstruction, which shows you not only the sperm head, shown with the black dot in here, which is conducting a helical pattern, but at the same time, the flagellum is being resolved here. This is very difficult to resolve because parts of this blue flagellum is actually on the order of about 200 nanometers and even thinner than that, and surrounded by liquid media. So that makes it quite challenging, and it's also beating in a large volume extremely rapidly. So the signal-to-noise ratio is very hard. It's a challenge for us to reconstruct. But here we're using two different perspectives of illumination again to reconstruct this complete motion of the sperm. You may be wondering what is this weird-looking coordinate system here, the green, orange, and red. That represents sitting at the head of the sperm, a virtual coordinate system positioned at the sperm head, which is telling you that the sperm is having a self-head spin. So this is enabled by phase wrapping events. For example, if you look at two different angles of illumination and how the phase is wrapping, you see this beautiful pulse train that's coming from the self-spin of the head. For a freely moving sperm, this is the complete locomotion pattern of the flagellum, the head conducting a beautiful helical pattern, and also showing you the self-spin. These are unique observations that could not be seen with traditional light microscopy tools because these are precise, they happen rarely, and at the same time, these are extremely weak signatures, and that's where phase contrast coming from these lens-free reconstructions are crucial for the success of these types of patterns. And this one is another type of a sperm, bovine sperm. Now it's like sniffing the signal, trying to find the next signal for chemotaxis behavior. So this is actually another beautiful sperm that landed on a surface and trying to find what to do next. Showing you again the power and the utility of lensless microscopy for looking into dynamic patterns of microswimmers. So in addition to various different microscopy tools, my lab is also quite interested in utilization of mobile instrumentation for sensing in field settings. And we've done quite a bit of work to utilize smartphones as part of our mobile measurement needs. And what I share with you here are some examples of that work, that line of work. We've done quite a bit of work on the use of smartphone-based systems for sensing pathogens, E. coli sensors, Giardia sensors. This one is a mobile fluorescence microscope with a smart front end. and it's backed up by machine learning to specifically detect Giardia cysts. Giardia is a waterborne pathogen, and it survives in cold water up to 6 to 9 months. That's why it's a problem for especially campers. So we've created this unique interface that can achieve about 1 colony-forming unit per liter level of sensitivity. And here pardon me, this is 1 CFU per milliliter level of sensitivity. Here we have another system which utilizes nanoparticles to look for heavy metal concentration, mercury 2 ions in drinking water, with 3 to 4 nanograms per mil level of detection limit, also published in our favorite journal, ACS Nano. So this is another instrumentation that we built for quantification of 96 well plates. Fluorometric, colorimetric well plates can be quantified. I must say this is quite relevant for today, given our challenges with COVID-19. Many of the today's COVID-19 tests are happening through this format of 96 well plates, and most of them are read with benchtop printer-size instrumentation for literally scanning 1 by 1 each well with an optical instrument, a scanning-based system. This is a mechanical scanning-free snapshot imaging system that can map all these wells into a fiber bundle to be imaged with the smartphone, and there's an app here that quantifies the signal of each well in parallel. So it's a very unique design, specifically for, I think, ELISA tests to be performed in field settings with handheld instrumentation. Quite robust. We've tested this system with 1,100 patient samples taken from UCLA Health. We have tested this with IgG, IgM assays, very much how we currently test COVID-19 antibody panel. We've shown that for HSV1, HSV2, measles, mumps, this was on par with FDA-approved instrumentation for quantification of those IgG, IgM assays. So highlighting you that it's really not, not just compactness, cost effectiveness, mobility, it's performance delivered as well. This was also published in ACS Nano. So these are giving you some examples of how we've been utilizing mobile instrumentation, computational imaging and sensing to create powerful imaging and sensing systems that help us with our measurement needs in field settings. Next, I'd like to talk to you about how deep learning has been helping us with some of these image reconstruction, image transformation needs to empower even some of those instrumentation to perform better than ever before, and how in general deep learning is changing the way that we do computational imaging and microscopy. So this is what I'm going to be sharing with you in the next several slides. I'll start with actually holographic microscopy. I've shown you various different types of holographic microscopes so far and what they can be used for, especially for mobile health related applications. Now let's look at how some of these reconstruction engines at the heart of a computational holographic microscope can be upgraded using machine learning. In a nutshell here, we're going to teach a deep neural net some physics through image data. So this is the same slide that I shown you a few minutes ago. It's a holographic input image that needs to be reconstructed, and there is a phase retrieval routine that is at the heart of these reconstructions. They look like speckle patterns to your eye. Only after phase retrieval you can reconstruct them to go back to the sample plane, as I've shown you in the past. Now, we can do the same kind of image reconstruction for a hologram using a deep neural net. So the past several decades, my lab and many other labs before us looked into phase retrieval and reconstruction of holograms. so that these speckle looking like features of a hologram can be reconstructed to reveal these beautiful patterns, in this case of a pap smear. And for that, you can utilize various different physical degrees of freedom. You can utilize multiple illumination wavelengths. You can utilize different angles of illumination, as I've shown you, at least partially. You can utilize different sample to sensor differences, and you name it. There are different physical parameters of the degrees of variables that you have in your setup that you can utilize to do phase retrieval and robust holographic reconstruction. By and large, the most competitive landscape is based on iterations and based on the understanding of light-matter interaction and light propagation in space. So this is at the heart of the past decades of work in holographic reconstruction. Now, deep neural nets are forming alternative paths. From physics-driven solutions, we're moving to data-driven image reconstruction modules that learn image transformation through image data. Yes, it takes a while to train a deep neural net through good quality training data. But one of the most exciting aspects of a deep neural net for image reconstruction is the fact that once you train it, it's fixed. And training is a one-time cost, which means reconstruction through a deep neural net happens in a single feed-forward manner without iterations. And that brings us speed advantage. That brings us confidence in quickly getting into the answer that we're looking for if the training is done right. So here, we're going to be actually taking one of our on-chip microscopes to generate data to teach a convolutional neural net the transformation that will take, for example, a single hologram's data without any phase retrieval. If you look at the amplitude and phase channel, it's all garbage because this doesn't have any phase information in it. As a result, there is two image and it's not usable. Now, we're going to be using physics-based reconstructions, the ground truth coming from our iterative solutions. The images that I've shown you before up to this point were all coming from this physics-based reconstruction. So that is going to be our ground truth. So this deep neural net, without understanding what it's doing, it's going to be doing this transformation from a hologram without any phase into actually a phase retrieved, cleaned image. So it's going to do phase retrieval and holographic reconstruction and learn that transformation without essentially learning what it's doing in terms of the physics of the wave propagation, etc. It's going to do this through data. This one is a UNet structure that we utilized here, a modest network in terms of its complexity and number of trainable variables. This kind of a UNet structure will be used throughout my talk repeatedly. It has a downsampling and an upsampling arm so that we can learn transformations at different spatial features, so that you can actually look at large objects, large holograms, small holograms, finer features. They can all be essentially learned through this scheme, which is great for, in general, image reconstruction or image transformation tasks. Of course, throughout my talk, we'll change this from application to application empirically. There's always a cost function. This cost function in this case is mean square error. We will change this cost function also from one application to the other. There will be other regularizer terms that will make this serve our purposes. The gist of this is, as you reconstruct by passing a hologram through this network, you will be penalizing based on the ground truth, and the penalty term will be propagated back till these neurons are fixed, their connections are fixed, so that you can actually establish a transformation by minimizing this cost function. So as I said, this is a fairly compact deep neural net, about 0.1 million learnable parameters across nine layers with 3x3 filter size and a rectified linear unit as the activation function. So this is a one-time effort that we feed this neural net with training data, which means you have holograms captured without phase retrieval. If you go back to a certain height within the sample, you have this complex image. You don't know how it looks in reality, but the neural net is panelized with respect to the ground truth, and this is how you fix the training, and then you're ready to do blind testing. So here I'm sharing with you blind testing results once the neural net has been trained. And everything that I will show throughout this talk, when I show you results of a deep neural net, they're coming from blind testing, meaning that these samples were never seen by the neural net before. You're looking at here a pap smear sample placed on a glass slide. This is the input to the neural net. No phase is recovered here. It's coming from a single hologram. Network's output is shown here. Beautiful amplitude and phase channel, nicely revealing the ground truth level of information that comes from a physics-based iterative reconstruction. So for these reconstructions that I show here, we used, in fact, 8 holograms and iteratively converged onto the amplitude and phase. What you see here is that there's a beautiful match between the network's output from a single hologram worth of information versus the 8 holograms that are used here. And there are also some differences. If you look at, for example, this feature here, there's a dust particle highlighted with this yellow arrow here. This dust particle is an out-of-focus particle. It was seated on top of the glass slide somewhere in the optical path. As you can see, this is attacked by the neural net, meaning that it's not satisfying this plane-to-plane transformation that the deep neural net has learned. It's actually to our advantage because we don't want to image dust particles or out-of-focus artifacts. We want to image the plane of the sample. And in that sense, even though the deep neural net deviated from the physics of the problem, wave propagation, by ignoring these terms, it's actually doing us a favor by better imaging the sample plane. This is also working for connected specimen. You may be wondering, well, this was a relatively sparse sample. Could it work for something like a connected tissue sample? Here I'm sharing with you a histopathologist slide. If you look at the network's input without phase retrieval, there's no feature there. You cannot reveal subcellular features in the amplitude and phase. At the network's output, you have a beautiful reconstruction, rapidly, nicely matching to physics-based reconstruction coming from 8 different holograms for both amplitude and phase channels. Once again, showing you that it works for complicated and dense samples. So indeed, the training takes a while, but it's a one-time effort. After this training, the inference is extremely fast, on the order of about 3 seconds for a millimeter square, using even a relatively modest and relatively old generation laptop. But the good thing is, compared to multi-height phase retrieval, which is our ground truth, you capture less holograms. A typical reconstruction will capture a few holograms to stabilize this reconstruction engine of iterations. But here, we only need a single hologram and much faster inference time. So it's making the entire framework of holographic reconstruction faster and with less data sufficient to generate competitive solutions. Actually, this is just the beginning. You can create various different exotic transformations using deep learning for inverting holograms. And here, we're going to ask the deep neural net to do 2 tasks at the same time. As before, we'll ask it to do phase recovery, to recover the phase information and reveal crystal clear images. But at the same time, we want it to do autofocusing. If you have a 3-dimensional sample with different objects at different heights, we want it phase retrieved and autofocused for every single object in your volume. This is actually a very useful and exotic transformation that is going to deviate from the physics of the problem even more. So here you take a similar convolutional neural net, and this time train it with a range of axially defocused holograms, which means you still use at the ground truth physics-based autofocus reconstructions, whatever the ground truth is, and for every object, every field of view, every object will be in focus. This is your ground truth. But to challenge the neural net, you're going to give not an in-focus hologram, not a single hologram. You will give a range of holograms, let's say spanning plus minus 100 microns. Within that range, the deep neural net will bring every single object into focus because it will be panelized when it's not in focus and when it's not doing phase retrieval, which means you're asking the neural net through data to do two things here: autofocusing across a certain axial range and phase retrieval at the same time. Once it's trained, it can actually perform some various exotic reconstructions that are not possible with traditional reconstruction methods. Let's look at a sample that is three-dimensional. We're looking at a polymer here that contains bioaerosols at different heights of its volume. If you do holographic imaging of a transparent polymer like this, for example, for air quality measurements, after phase retrieval, if you go to one plane, let's say relatively minus 10 microns, this plane contains certain particles at different positions within that field of view. If you virtually go to another plane within the sample, within the 3D sample, you will see other particles coming into focus, and so on and so forth as you scan through this volume, which means traditional computational reconstruction engine of a holographic system will have computational complexity on the order of nm, meaning that if you have n particles that are spread over, let's say, m different planes, you will have to go back and bring one by one these particles into focus, and it will be taking a while to do this autofocusing and phase retrieval across different regions of interest, across different planes. What the neural net here does is very interesting. You take a single hologram that encodes all this information. Without phase retrieval, the information is again, as before, not revealing anything useful. At the output of the neural net, you bring a beautifully phase retrieved image without two image artifact, but at the same time, all these particles that were spread across the volume, they're now brought into focus within the axial depth of the training, which means the computational complexity here is now on the order of 1. Within a single output of the deep neural net, we brought everything into focus and phase retrieve at the same time. If you look at one of those particles, the full width at maximum of that particle as a function of axial distance is flat with the deep neural net. It's extending the depth of field. And the training of this deep neural net was plus minus 100 micron, and that makes sense. And this one is how traditional phase retrieval and holographic reconstruction performs. As shown here, it quickly gets larger and larger and gets out of focus as you slightly move from the correct focus. This is expected. This also works beautifully well with connected tissue samples. This is also a pathology sample. As shown here, over this 100 micron axial depth that the neural net was trained for, it's beautifully in focus. And this is a traditional holographic reconstruction. As you move it out of focus, features get lost, as expected. So this is helping you to engineer the depth of field of your reconstruction and perform autofocusing across a volume and make it much faster to scan through a volume as opposed to one by one finding these particles, autofocusing, and reconstructing them. You may be thinking that these are exotic transformations that we're playing with. In reality, these are helping our mobile instrumentation to get better and more powerful in terms of what they do. Through this deep learning-based holographic reconstruction, we're enabling higher throughput screening of large volumes of, for example, water, air, bodily fluids, and also maintaining a compact and field portable instrumentation. For example, this one is an imaging flow cytometer that's based on lensless microscopy and deep learning powered. It has a throughput of about 100 milliliters to 500 milliliters an hour. It flushes a specimen with a very large throughput and reconstructs their images using a laptop on demand, almost in real time. These are algae particles imaged in Los Angeles coastal line. Believe it or not, some of these particles are toxic and they can actually kill fish. Last year, it cost Florida about $120 million in the summer because of toxic algae blooms. Chile, a couple of years ago, lost $800 million because of these some of these particles. So it's a beautiful instrument that's powered by deep learning. The channel height of the disposable microfluidic chip here is about a millimeter. Across that channel, as objects are flowing, we can reconstruct their beautiful images in real time. And another beautiful application of this platform is detection of mold spores and pollen bioaerosols without labeling. For example, this one is an air quality measurement system. It has a polymer disposable cartridge here. This is the inlet where you take in air at a throughput of about 13 liters per minute, which means the particles are captured on a polymer substrate, which is placed on a chip for imaging. Based on spatial and spectral features of these objects, we can detect and classify mold spores and pollen particles without labeling them. We've achieved more than 94% classification accuracy for black mold and 3 different types of pollen particles. So in a nutshell, for biosensing purposes, for sensing of bioaerosols or even viruses and algae, we're using deep neural net-based solutions to empower our mobile instrumentations. It's not just an exotic transformation. These are very useful transformations, helping us retain beautiful image quality and at the same time rapidly harness the power of this data. Next, I'd like to talk to you about cross-modality image transformations, which help us to bring some very exotic transformations that are not possible today. Here, we're going to be taking a hologram and reconstructing it with the spatial contrast of bright field microscopy. So cross-modality transformations are very exciting because through data, you can actually form reconstruction paths that are very difficult, if not impossible, to imagine today. This is a very difficult transformation because holography is coherent and single frequency, and bright field microscopy is incoherent and it has color to it. So how can we actually reconstruct holograms with bright field contrast? Well, it's possible through data. What I share here with you is actually the training process. You take 3-dimensional samples that you first image with a holographic microscope, create essentially a stack of standard holograms at different heights, and the same samples are mechanically scanned with a bright field benchtop microscope, so that for every single hologram, we have a corresponding ground truth coming from the bright field microscope, which means now the holographic input will be panelized with respect to a certain axial plane that it's reconstructing, with respect to its cost function, its distance from this bright field microscope image of the same specimen. So these are some examples of this cross-modality transformation network, which takes a hologram. These are pollen particles. These are beautiful holographic images of these pollen particles spread across a volume. If you don't do any phase retrieval, this is how it looks, phase and amplitude channel. At the network's output, it clears all of that speckled pattern artifacts and creates a reconstruction matching the contrast, resolution, and the color of a bright field microscope, corresponding bright field microscope. These are blind testing results, meaning that these samples were never seen by the network before. So you can clearly see the power of the cross-modality transformation network, giving you something that holographic microscopy could never achieve with simple reconstruction methods. Of course, the advantage here is that you can take any hologram and virtually scan through the sample and create corresponding bright field microscopy reconstructions without the need for any mechanical scan. Because if you look at a bright field microscope, it scans through these samples one plane at a time. Here, everything is virtual. A single hologram is acquired across this polymer volume, and you can virtually scan through this as if there was a mechanical scanning system. This movie here is highlighting the whole story. A single hologram is all you need to create these output images shown here. This is the bright field comparison. As you can see, even the way that these pollen particles get into focus and get out of focus is nicely matching the comparison mechanical scan coming from the bright field microscope, which means the three-dimensional point spread function of the transformation is really faithful to the physics of the problem. In other words, the neural net is extracting physical parameters through image data, through well-registered image data. These are very exciting results, and it brings best of both worlds. Volumetric reconstruction coming from a hologram, and the beautiful contrast, axial section and capability, and color contrast of bright field microscopy is now available at the output of this cross-modality transformation network. Cross-modality networks can also be utilized in different aspects of microscopy, spatially to perform super resolution. Because certain microscopy modalities have higher resolution, they can beat diffraction limit. What if you could take actually a diffraction limited microscope and train it with respect to the images coming from a super resolution microscope? So you can actually achieve super resolution through a deep neural net through data. So a good example of this is shown with this network that was trained to perform confocal to STED transformation. STED is Slate emission depletion microscopy. It's a nonlinear microscopy modality that beats diffraction limit of light. And these are 20 nanometer particles that we've imaged with the confocal microscope. These are the network's input images. If you zoom in to different parts here, you can find particles that are very close to each other, cannot be resolved. At the network's output, they're nicely resolved, as shown here, with the correct distances between the two particles. And the ground truth is coming from a STED microscope, revealing the same information, basically. These are all blind testing results. Here, the neural net is doing some sort of a frequency extrapolation. And you can actually understand that through a point spread function. By looking at these 20 nanometer particles and their fluid at maximum values, at the network input, you have a diffraction limited distribution, which is at the network's output left shifted, as expected, nicely matching STED images of the same sample. So it's matching the PSF distribution expected from the super resolution microscope. We've also done imaging of HeLa cells with this. Network's input, confocal images shown here. At the network's output, some of these features are nicely super resolved, and this is the STED comparison showing you a similar performance to network's output. One of the biggest successes that we've achieved with this cross-modality transformation has been, in fact, turf-to-turf SIM. SIM is another microscopy modality, structured illumination microscopy, that uses structured illumination at different angles to do frequency shifting. Higher spatial frequencies are shifted down to the passband, and you can digitally synthesize a higher numerical aperture and create super resolved images through SIM. This is a turf SIM structure, total internal reflection fluorescence microscopy. If you look at the input images of this example, these are clathrin-coated structures within live cells that could not be super resolved because of the limitations of diffraction. In this case, if you look at any one of those structures, you have some resolution, beautiful dark field background, but resolution is limited. At the network's output, they're super resolved, nicely matching SIM results. SIM here utilized 9 different exposures, meaning that it utilized 9 different structured illumination patterns to synthesize these images. Here, for turf, the input is a single frame, and that's the advantage of it. In terms of phototoxicity, in terms of photon dose, that is there are significant advantages of utilizing a single exposure and revealing similar resolution patterns. This is a movie of the same process. This is a live cell. As these structures are assembling, we stopped the movie showing you the super resolution, nicely matching a sim reconstruction of the same live cell. These are all blind testing results, never seen by the network before. Interestingly, this can also be tested more rigorously in terms of its generalization. Here, we're using a different type of an object. All the previous results that I've shown you were cells in the training and testing phase. And that's why you could see beautiful dark field. These were not scattering as much. These were very nice dark field images. So the network was trained with these types of samples. But here, I'm going to a tissue sample to test the same network that has never seen tissue before. If you look at the input images, there's more scattering. The background increased. And that is because of scattering. But even then, the neural net actually performs, despite the change in data statistics of the input images, beautiful reconstructions, nicely matching TURF sim results of the same samples. So these are entirely new types of samples that we've imaged. This is a live Drosophila embryo that we're imaging with TURF here. Network's output is shown here. And this is the sim result. So there are different kinds of transformations that you can do. One of the recent work that we've done is actually appending to the input image a digital propagation matrix to take this image and virtually propagate it across different planes within a sample. And this virtual propagation framework is extremely powerful. You can take images that are distorted in different ways and transform them using a certain digital propagation matrix. For example, this is an image that is on purpose tilted. With a certain digital propagation matrix, the neural net is actually tilting it back and focusing it to the correct plane. You can also do like a cylindrical or a spherical perturbation and correct it using this virtual propagation framework. So indeed, cross-modality transformations are helping us in unique ways to enhance our microscopy experience. In the interest of time, I'll move forward with some of these slides and come to my last 5 minutes of my slides, where I'd like to share with you a very exciting application of cross-modality image transformations for specifically transforming label-free autofluorescence images into bright field equivalent microscopy images. So here the transformation that we are after is a little bit more exotic. You take as input fluorescence images and you want to transform into a bright field equivalent image. That's number one. Number two, the sample is different. Label-free at the input, ground truth will be labeled. So you may be wondering, what is this weird transformation? What is it for? Well, it's actually going to change the way that we do histopathology and staining in pathology services. So because every time we take a biopsy from a patient, this specimen tissue section goes through a lengthy and laborious process of staining. So if you take the tissue and cut it into a thin section, it's like glass. It doesn't show any contrast. You cannot see any microscopic feature. And that's the reason why, for the last century, at least, we've been staining tissue so that it looks colorful under a bright field microscope. This kind of texture is what goes to pathologists for their diagnosis. What if we could stop the process here and take this label-free tissue section and capture an autofluorescence image of it, which means now this grayscale image is a beautiful microscopic image. It has texture at the microscale, nanoscale, but there's no external fluorophore here. It's endogenous fluorophores that create this contrast. And a deep neural net here is going to be trained to do this transformation of label-free autofluorescence images transformed into bright field looking stained images matching what comes from our pathology labs, bypassing the entire histochemical staining process. This is achieved through a regularized GAN structure, generated adversarial network. It's actually two networks fighting with each other. This is the generator, this is the artist that takes these label-free images and creates virtually stained images that cannot be distinguished from what comes from the histopathology lab, chemically stained. So this process is chemistry-free, and that's one of the biggest advantages. I'll give you examples of it. This is salivary gland that we're testing blindly, this neural net. And the ground truth is H&E stained. It's a chemical stain. For humans, it takes about 1 to 2 hours to stain tissue with H&E stain. These are ground truth coming from our pathology lab at UCLA. These are our input images, grayscale, beautiful contrast. This is the only input to the neural net to virtually create these images, nicely matching to the ground truth. This is extremely fast, on the order of seconds for a field of view like this, whereas this would take, across the whole slide, a couple of hours. This is another one. This is kidney tissue section, and a different type of stain, Jones-Silver stain. Ground truth coming from human technologists. These technologies are shown here. And this is how our virtual staining results look, beautifully matching the ground truth. And some examples are also shown here for liver tissue sections and lung tissue sections here. So I'm seeing some problem with the slides. Do you see my current slides, or because I still see on the screen, Alice's screen, just a fluorescence image. Do you see my current slide on liver and lung?
Yes.
Okay, great. So it must be a trouble with the screen. So to summarize, these are beautiful results with a third type of stain, Mason's trichome, showing nicely matching ground truth coming from his technologists. We've given these types of images to board-certified pathologists to make sure that the staining quality is maintained and the diagnostic accuracy that can be achieved with our results match essentially what can be diagnosed through standard chemical staining process. Meaning that we've shown with board-certified pathologists in blinded testing that there is literally no clinically significant difference in the diagnosis performed through virtually stained images versus standard histochemically stained images. One of the most important advantages of this framework is standardization. Not only it's chemistry-free, fast, and inexpensive, but at the same time, we standardize the stain quality. If you look at the human histechnologists, there's a lot of variation. This is H&E from different histechnologists at UCLA. Quite a bit of variation, which we avoid, which is very important for human diagnosticians as well as for machine learning-based methods to diagnose disease. Another very exciting aspect of this work is that it's going to enable multiple stains on the same cross-section. You can take an image of chemistry-free, unlabeled tissue and generate spatial stains and H&E on the same cross-section. This kind of an experience is not possible today with traditional methods. And what you see, for example, if you want to get from the same patient different stains, those will come from different cross-sections, which will deplete tissue. Here, it doesn't deplete tissue, and it's all registered at the same cross-section. You can also do stain blending and create some very interesting exotic transformations. You can take autofluorescence images and append here a certain staining matrix that switches from one type of stain to another. And in fact, it can also do structured blending of these two. So we can actually take different sections of tissue and stain them with different stains virtually and perform blending of different stains. It's kind of like new chemistry experiments without chemicals. You can create different ratios of one stain versus another stain and create new contrasts that would require a histechnologist to play with different protocols to create a new chemical. This will be all done virtually as shown here. So to sum up, conclude, virtual staining is a paradigm shift for histopathology. It will save time and labor for labeling of features in tissues and biopsies. Obviously, because it's chemistry free, it will save costs in terms of training, personnel, reagents. Another very interesting and exciting aspect is that it permits tissue preservation for advanced molecular analysis, which is very important. And it also standardizes the stain quality, which means something that we observe, for example, in Asia, in Europe, in US, the same type of tissue stain combination would come with various different variations. That would not be the case with virtual staining, which is a huge advantage at a global scale. So these are very exciting results where we currently are further validating them with diagnosticians, with our colleagues from pathology, working hand in hand with us to understand the limitations of this technology and improve it to the level where it meets the clinical needs that we have in pathology today. So to summarize, deep learning has been helping us with our image reconstruction, image transformation, image enhancement needs, all the way from coherent imaging, from holographic microscopy to mobile instrumentation, to super resolution, and as I've explained, to pathology and staining in histopathology. These are some unique experiences that are created by deep neural nets. So we're moving rapidly toward thinking instrumentation, thinking microscopes, thinking sensors that would merge machine learning, data-driven transformations as part of the instrumentation. Not just like you digitize information, and then act on it. This is the traditional paradigm. Smart systems will be much more efficient in terms of their power, in terms of their voxel requirements, number of pixels that they acquire, by fusing in these transformations as part of the hardware and making microscopy smarter and more efficient. With this, I'd like to conclude and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and look forward to having some of your questions. Thanks again.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Out to them as a way to do a more thorough diagnosis. It's something that maybe wouldn't be possible with a normal stain because you're kind of looking at everything at one time, whereas you could do a digital filtering to say, you know, here's one aspect of what you're looking at, and here's another, and kind of take the data back apart to highlight something that may be, for instance, abnormal.
Absolutely. I think those are very exciting aspects. Do I have the chance to go back to one of my slides, or have I lost control of my slides? Okay, all right. So that's a great opportunity actually that you're asking. So because in today's practice of pathology, everything starts with H&E. Let's say there's a certain organ transplant patient, potential suspicion that it's a rejection. Everything starts with an H&E, and the pathologist looks at the H&E, quickly decides if spatial stains are required. Most often they are required. H&E is, most often not conclusive enough. That's what feedback we get from our colleagues in pathology. Then they send another request to the pathology lab to capture more spatial stains, maybe 3 additional stains. And then they come, but they come from different sections within the tissue block. You not only deplete the tissue of the patient, but the information is not also registered, and it's coming literally from different physical parts of the 3D sample. So what we enable by virtual staining is that you don't deplete tissue. That's great. No need for a new biopsy. But at the same time, those spatial stains and the H&E are registered to each other. So basically, the diagnostician can look at all that information channel at the same time and flip between different channels of stain. So we're now in the process of evaluating what this brings to the mind of the pathologist, and trying to work with groups to see how they can make better use of this. It's a hard question to answer because they don't know the answer, because they've never got this experience of looking at the same cross section with different filters, and how that additional information channel can enrich their decision making. But this is what we have as a hypothesis, that it's better to see the same features at different contrasts, and in fact flip back and forth. If you look at CT images, this is frequently done. Like they have all the degrees of freedom in CT, and they have all the filters applied with the fingertip of the diagnostician, and they have been trained to do that. But pathology is behind in digitization. Digital pathology is still at its infancy. Compared to digital medicine and medical imaging like CT, MRI, pathology is really, really way behind. But I think in the next decade, this is going to change. And I think virtual staining with its unique features will bring new contrast mechanisms that I believe will also change the training partially of diagnosticians, how to make better use of that. This is the human aspect of what will probably change. There's also a lot of things to change in machine learning, because machine learning will also benefit that. In other words, algorithms that, for example, aim to stage the tumor margin detection, cancer lesion detection, those algorithms will also enjoy the fact that different color channels are all at the same feature. So rather than learning spatial variations from one cross-section to another cross-section, looking at different contrast mechanisms at the same cross-section will also teach new features, new capabilities to, I think, machine learning models all across the space.
Good. Let me ask you the first question from the audience. Can your AI microscope be used to detect or to trace COVID-19?
Great question. Great question. Certainly, it's a major problem for all of us in the world right now. So one project where I haven't talked about it in this presentation because of lack of time. One area where we are very excited about is the use of deep neural nets in multiplexed sensing. So we have some vertical flow assays that we've created. You can look this up. It's published in the last couple of months, where rather than looking at a single immunoreaction, we look at tens and in fact up to 100 different immunoreactions at the same time. And that information is feeding to a neural net for a diagnostic decision. And this is specifically great for antibody detection, IgG, IgM, panel detection. So we are right now having the initial bits of work planning to utilize this deep learning enabled vertical flow assay, multiplex vertical flow assay, to test basically immunity of patients. One of the challenges that we see for COVID-19 and beyond is testing immunity. There are, of course, vaccine development efforts, and also there is herd immunity that we are, seeing in the world. So nobody knows the lifetime of the immunity and the quality of the immunity, either through herd immunization or through a later stage a vaccine that will come, let's say, toward the end of the year or early next year. We need better tools to deal with all this complex immunity of the patients, to be able to tell if vaccines are working, if how long they're effective for, and if some part of the population are already immunized. We need to have better, inexpensive tools that can do this at scale. It cannot be based on standard ELISA tests. It will be too costly to do this in billions. We're thinking of paper-based, very inexpensive platforms on the order of, a few tens of cents per test that can do this very rigorously. And I think neural nets will be a key part of it. The reason is very simple. The immunity is very complex, and it changes, I think, based on the exposure of the patient. Let's say you're in Asia, you have been exposed to previous coronaviruses. Your profile is quite different than us, maybe other parts of the world where we didn't get exposed to coronaviruses. It also is a function of other influenza strains that we have seen, we have been infected with, and how it boosts up certain IgM, IgG profiles in our serum samples. All of this complexity of previous exposure and our own complexity of immunity and the variations require data-intensive tests, I believe. And one of the best ways of doing it is actually using multiplex sensors that can screen a panel of IgG and IgM in a multiplex manner inexpensively and parallel, and feed that to a trained system. That means the more data we understand in terms of those patients who had, for example, other exposures to coronavirus or seasonal flu, how does it change from region to region? All of those are data problems that we believe with inexpensive multiplex sensors powered by deep learning we can potentially address. That's an angle that I am currently trying to move forward.
The next question is it possible to do super resolution microscopy portably with this instrument you've developed?
So portable instrumentation beating the diffraction limit of light could be possible with certain assumptions, I believe, like localization microscopy, I think, Palm, Storm type of localization microscopy tools, I think could potentially be miniaturized and still work. The rule of the game for microscopy in general to beat the diffraction limit of light is signal to noise ratio. There's a common misconception about the fact that most microscopy modalities don't have evanescent waves present at the detector. As a result, there's a fundamental frequency gap to go to super resolution. One thing that I want to emphasize is that computational microscopes that utilize a computational reconstruction engine and a prior information, they're not limited by evanescent waves or the passband of an imaging system in principle. They're only limited by the signal to noise ratio and by the fidelity of your prior information regarding the sample. So if your SNR and prior information regarding the sample help you, you can actually maintain, at least over a small field of view, decent resolution that can surpass the diffraction limit of light. In that regard, certainly, I believe field portable super resolution instruments are possible. We have seen tremendous advances in mobile instruments and their signal to noise ratio.
Next question is, for the portable devices you demonstrated, are they commercialized and available? And do samples need pre-treatment? And do they need to be used by professionals, or can normal users manage their use?
Great question. Not all the instruments that we have created are commercialized. We have tens of different types of instruments that we've created, probably more than 100 in reality. And maybe a handful of them have been commercialized and are in the process of being commercialized. In terms of sample handling in terms of what kinds of pre-processing that is required. It depends on the type of instrument. So there's not a single answer that fits all. Certainly, certain instruments are minimal in terms of the sample preparation. For example, the imaging flow cytometer that I've shown you, the one that imaged algae, it's a beautiful instrument. It doesn't have any sample preparation requirement. It's label-free. It takes ocean water, any water sample, without touching it, without chemically interfering with it. It can actually image it and do some sensing based on spatial and spectral features. So that's one example where sample preparation is not at all there. You don't have to do any sample preparation. But there are others that require sample preparation. And that's why most of these instruments are still for professional use, not for home use. Although, depending on how it's productized, we can envision that they can also work at the home by minimally trained users.
Fantastic. I think on that note, let's thank Professors Ozcan and Xu, and especially Professor Alice Zhang and her team at Beida for putting on these amazing lectures. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again next Friday. And enjoy the holiday in China. It's a special group of people that come out 300,000 strong for a lecture on a Friday evening on a national holiday. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, great. Paul, thank you so much. Actually, I'm so glad to see that, tonight we are really successful. We got 320, now it's 30, thousand people's audience on the, on this ICANX talks. So proud of you guys giving some nice talks. So I have to cut all these, questions, but I will send to Ozcan later. Okay, thank you very much for all these wonderful talks. Actually, we will move to next week. We have Deji, we have Tahik, one from UT Austin, one from France. So guest hoster will be Tao Li. So we will have a very nice Friday next week too. And we have this bunch of technical report. I hope you enjoy it. And this was the Young Scientist Forum. Will run very soon, so please register for free. And this was the special day for the light, the laser, so will be July 24th. And this will be the second ICANX ACN Rising Star lectures. So remember, you got Paul's email. That's more important, and you can dream me on that. And that's a bunch of people was on the list. We will have all these speakers come to you on ICANX talks. So I see you every Friday. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Also goes up and down.
Okay.
We find,
yes,
in the last week more than previously. I'm not sure.
Same, exactly. So it was working very solid, very nice over the last whatever. But last week has changed, and it's frequently freezing.
I'm going to have to cut out. I actually have an editors meeting that started 10 minutes ago, so I'm going to cut out. But that was fantastic, you two. Let's catch up shortly.